Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, Director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins at Multnomah Seminary and University, and we're here this afternoon for a conversation on faith and science. It's on the topic of genetics, genetic reductionism, and it's part of our AAAS grant, or the American Association for the Advancement of Science grant, that we have in conjunction with Templeton. And AAAS here is one of the 10 seminaries nationally that has received the grant. And it's part of our forums on Church and Science Partners for the Common Good. The specific title is, How do we move from scientific and genetic reductionism to an expansive view of life? And the participants for today's discussion are Dr. Steve Kolmes, Chair of Environmental Studies, University of Portland, Dr. Sarah Gall, Biology Department Chair, Multnomah University, Sharad, Yadav, and we never can quite figure out how to pronounce it, pastor of Bread and Wine Church, Portland. David Wilson, Dr. David Wilson, pastor and adjunct professor of theology at George Fox. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce Wilson either. And then Derrick Peterson, my partner in crime at New Wine, New Wineskins, the administrative coordinator here. So starting off, and this is for all of the contributors, what is scientific and genetic reductionism from your vantage point?
I think it's probably several things. Maybe there's not one reductionism. There's a sort of ontological reductionism, a way of saying that the smallest possible parts of a thing just are that thing. And then there's maybe a epistemological type of reductionism that says the best way to understand or explain a thing is in terms of the lowest level of explanation. And then there's a kind of maybe methodological reductionism that seeks to not make any commitments about those other things, but still thinks the best way forward in research programs is to explain in terms of the lowest possible level.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Start right out of the gate. Other thoughts there in that regard?
It's a tough act to follow.
Yeah, I wrote it on my hand. So
that's good.
Yeah.
I thought I saw you.
Can I share your notes?
Yeah.
So one way a biologist would think about it would be constructing an hypothesis to focus on a very specific factor that's presumably causal in a system, to search for the simplest explanation you can find consistent with experimental results.
I think then wrapped up within it is a belief. There's a value system that's part of reductionism as well that has a core belief about complexity and simplicity, and that we can get to the simple, that there is something knowable about the very finite, smaller parts of the things that often form the more complex structures, whether it's in genetics or any other kind of science, and that branches into other disciplines as well. But that core belief that you can get at the smaller parts in order to understand the whole better.
And I think even going with that, it's part of that quest of science to get further and further down to find out what is truly real. You know, what's smaller than the electron, what's smaller than the quark, what else is down there, becomes kind of a driving quest in a lot of aspects of science.
And I think on top of all that, there's I think a distinction between, well, people are really bad, I think, at making connections on a day-to-day level, and we have sort of common intuitions about what is or is not the truth. And I think the term like folk psychology, for example, or maybe even folk biology is kind of thrown around. And so I think Wilfrid Sellers made a distinction between the manifest image, and that's kind of how we take everyday life. You know, we see people and we see colors, and we interact with these large-scale objects, and we think we know causally how they work. But then he also made a distinction of the scientific image, where we try to kind of isolate more and more what is actually functioning. And I think, for example, like historically with Galileo, you know, everyone thought with the Earth rotating around the sun, it'd be crazy. You know, when you drop a cannonball from a tower, it drops straight down. It doesn't fall 40, 100 feet away, which you might expect if the Earth was actually moving. And so what actually had to happen was they had to isolate certain things where we now know about inertia, and he was actually, in one way, he had to teach a whole new way of seeing things. And so I think reductionism in that sense is trying to isolate aspects of our experience and almost teaching us to make connections or unmake connections that we often do in our everyday experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems the controversy in thinking about the reason there might be some sort of a apprehension about reductionism, scientific reductionism, is the fear that maybe by boiling things down to their smallest constituent parts, you're boiling off something essential or necessary. You're denying something about our common experience of what is real. And that's sort of seems to be the nub of the question about it, is can you really fully explain something in terms of its smallest constituent parts, and to what degree is that satisfactory explanation of a phenomenon?
Yeah, it reminds me of, unfortunately can't remember the Nobel Prize winner, but he won a Nobel Prize for biology, and in his speech, one of the quotes that just kind of burned itself into my mind was, he says that biologists no longer study life because there is nothing to that word, life. Life is, to him, it was a metaphysical kind of entity that we superimpose on things.
And in fact, it comes out sometimes where people say that biology is really just chemistry.
Yeah.
And chemistry is really physics.
That's right.
Yeah. And so that can be going into that.
Absolutely. So I think it's just, to your point, I think there's a real fear of, am I just atoms?
Yeah.
Am I just...
Right, and particularly at the higher levels of study, so you can climb from above biology to psychology and into the closer it seems you get to human sciences, the more controversial it is, because it seems to be saying that these experiences are somehow fundamentally not as real as the smallest constituent explanation. So, things like consciousness and
Dr. Kolmes, were you going to add?
Well, what you're talking about is emergent properties, right? And so in complicated systems, there are properties that are self-assembling, that emerge from fundamental properties. And we know those are true. You can't see those from taking a reductionistic approach, although there's also things you can't see without taking that approach.
Right, yeah.
Dr. Gall and Dr. Kolmes, what would be an example of scientific and genetic reductionism from your fields of work?
Well, I think the way we do a lot of our molecular biology and cell biology research is sort of by definition a reductionist approach, where you look for how a particular protein binds to a second protein, or the particular effects that you see with a particular mutation in a cell, where you look at one particular change and see what the effects are of that. Sometimes it's done even in what we would call an in vitro study, where you're looking at proteins in test tubes. If I have a protein with this shape, does it still bind to a second protein? If I change the shape, will it still bind? And so that can become a very reductionistic approach. It's not necessarily bad, because it does allow us to tease apart interactions where you've got thousands of proteins in a cell, and you can look at one specific one without all of the background noise going on. But a lot of biochemistry, cell biology, and molecular biology do use a very reductionistic, I guess, as you said, a methodological reductionist approach.
Thank you.
So I guess for environmental science, the most obvious thing is we actually have separated the study of what ought to be a unified field into environmental science and the science of human health. And in fact, it really is just one thing, because the environment affects humans and humans affect the environment. But because we've structured this disciplinary separation, most work is done, well, with his back turned on the other half of the whole field. And we set it up that way decades ago, and it continues that way.
It would seem to me to be the case then with what Sarah, you had articulated. It was more what I'm going to call genetic reduction. When I'm thinking of reductionism, I'm thinking about in more negative terms. And what I heard you saying is that for the sake of the discipline, there's a time where you need to set apart other considerations so you can really analyze it for what it is all about. Whereas what I hear you saying, Steve, is more of a negative aspect or effect that resulted from the kind of bracketing of the human and the natural. Would that be the case? That's more what I'm going to call the ism, reductionism.
So I would say that the separation of funding for medical research and environmental research is reductionism because it causes research to be structured in a narrower way than a holistic approach would take. Within each of those fields, there's necessary reduction. You do have to do experiments. You do have to understand the systems and choose the variables you're going to work at. So reduction exists in both of those, and that whole separation is a large-scale form of reductionism.
According to James Watson, co-discoverer of the double helix structure of genes, when we map the genome, we'll have the ultimate description of life. Steve and Sarah, what do you make of Watson's claim?
It's actually an essay question I've given to students for years on a genetics exam, and it's interesting to see the responses because I have plenty of students who say, oh yeah, DNA is the instructions, it will tell us everything, and how rare it is for a student to actually come out and say, but no, I'm more than just my genes, I'm more than just my DNA. And I think that's something that actually does strike at the heart of people. We don't like being told that we're just atoms. I'm just a product of my atoms. What I see is just a product of light waves and things like that. And so I think it's certainly part of what it means to be human, because what I can do and what my cells can do makes me human in part, but I don't think it describes the totality of our human experience and our emotions and our experiences and give us meaning in that way.
Steve?
Even from just a biological perspective, that's a pretty limited and dated statement. So we know now that if you take a gene sequence, that the expression of those genes, making proteins of it, through gene editing can actually produce a lot of different proteins from the same DNA sequence, and different proteins when the body needs different things. We also know that epigenetic changes in the histone proteins that the DNA is wrapped around, or the density of methyl groups attached to the DNA, change gene expression. That genes can be turned on and off, accelerated or stopped. And we even know now that environmental factors can impact the epigenetics, and so the environment can change the way your genes are expressed. And for humans, it's been shown that the environment, even in terms of poverty, stress, nutrition, can change your gene expressions, and that these expressions are actually heritable for generations. And so the idea that a simple gene sequence fully describes what's going on is already a very dated version of biology.
Along those lines, it would seem in some contexts that that's a line or a story or a myth that has a slow death. It seems like a lot of people still maintain that orientation. I mean, you'll find advertisements on, you can trace your genetic history and, unlock the keys to the universe is the way it comes across. And people are making money off of that. And it seems to me that, in popular circles, and we'll get into this a bit more later, no doubt, it's very difficult for some of those lines, those storylines made by scientists or historians to be put to rest permanently. Would you agree with that? That it sometimes is hard to bring an end to those statements?
Yeah, and I think this is also where you see the rise of companies where you can send your own DNA off to be sequenced, so I can know more about what it means to be me. I think we also see this also coming into into medicine, where we look at sort of, my genes say this, so therefore this is the way my body works best. So you start seeing even there this kind of idea of genes determining my health, my outcomes, and things like that. But I do think it's interesting. I was just talking to somebody today about sending sending my genome, well, not mine personally, but the ability to send our genomes out to get sequenced and then get that information back. Well, what would I do with that? I mean, I'm a biologist. That's not anything I really feel would be useful for me personally, but plenty of people do feel that it is worthwhile.
Yeah, but the power of this idea that you can explain something fundamental about yourself if you just carve down to the smallest bits, that you can unlock something or find something so basic that it gives the answers to everything. I mean, I think that's a powerful idea. So, yeah, it's the same reason maybe people take personality tests. It's like, I want to find out more about who I am. That can't be that in some quasi-scientific way. That
I'm always afraid to take one of those personality
mine always
really
just
don't
come
wanna
out
find
totally
out.
blank. Like, I think I failed the personality test.
Well, and inherent in that, I mean, you can have your genome sent off. They can tell you something about the geographic affinities, right? Inherent in that is the fact that there's huge genetic variability among humans. So when you talk about the Human Genome Project and describing what life is, well, whose genes do you mean? There's enough variability that it's clear that there isn't a human genome. There are a great many gene variations among humans. And so there is no sort of single genetic sequence that describes humans. It might be an imperfect description of part of one human, but there are currently about 7 billion of us.
Wow. Yeah.
Dr. Kolmes has stated that the science provides great maps, but not the directions and how to get from one place to another. I'll ask you, Steve, to unpack that statement a bit and then open it up to everyone here. How might that fit in terms of our discussion?
Sure. So the biological sciences, the physical sciences, we're very good at mapping the universe. We can describe details. We can describe sort of the topography of cause and effect. We can describe chemical reactions and spectra and different kinds of biological processes. And it's kind of like we're drawing this big, increasingly detailed map of the universe from cosmology down to subatomic particles. But that's just a map. While it has a lot of detail about where things are, it doesn't tell you where you ought to go. And a map is absolutely useless, even if you know the spot you're located at, unless you have a compass also. And the compass that helps you determine which way you should be headed, that's a moral and ethical compass. Scientists sometimes mistake themselves as map makers for compass makers, but they're not.
Thoughts?
Interesting.
I just remember a point that philosopher named Alistair McIntyre made in his book After Virtue, and he's kind of talking about the emergence of a kind of scientific culture in the 17th century, and with Aristotelianism, which was kind of the reigning science of the day, everything was thought to have a natural end to it, and that this was very specific, so the nature of what a thing was. Is this a good bottle of water? Well, is it holding the water properly? Is it able to be grabbed by me? And so these kind of, we might say that facts had intrinsic moral properties. And one of the things that he describes is, as a scientific culture, one of the necessary things it needed to progress was kind of a separation of these facts from these more nebulous moral qualities that were often harder to talk about and less easy to isolate. And so I think that kind of plays into what science is today. It's very good at sort of isolating certain data and quantitative analysis, but then there's this whole other realm of interpretation, of qualitative analysis, even like it's almost a textual interpretation of moral inquiry and all that. And I think I think the map metaphor is a really powerful way of kind of encapsulating that.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think the seduction of that going from map maker to compass maker seems really powerful, partly because of the explanatory power of science. I mean, it seemed to be able to adjudicate between cross-culturally, between deep religious and ethical divides. It seemed like a place a person might stand on neutral ground to agree. But then, thinking about how that could possibly extend to the oughtness of human existence and what we should do and where we should go, it seems like that hunger for the same certainty and the same authority to be able to decide those matters is a kind of I don't know. It's like the golden ticket, It's so I can see the seduction of it, but
Well, and there are compass makers, right? I mean, we call them philosophers, theologians, statesmen. There's different names for different kinds of compass makers. It's just really important that scientists not mistake their own expertise for a universal expertise that extends into other realms.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that comes to mind just in when you get into day-to-day conversations about this type of thing, and you're talking with a person on the street, you're talking with a family member, you're talking with someone in a community that you're part of, a workplace, a congregation, is the assignation of meaning. And how quickly do we get to here's what science can tell us to here's what it means? And there's some fear, there's some anxiety about that meaning giving process, and whose job is it to give that meaning? Now that we've got this isolation, now that we've said that this does that, this is related to that, we've isolated even a very small relationship. What does that mean for my self-understanding, which is, in a narcissistic society, I think one of the first places we go. But even in a communal sense, environmental sciences, how does this integrate with my larger view of the world and my responsibility within it? So now we've crossed that line of ethics and saying, okay, now which compass maker am I going to go to? Who's going to speak into that meaning now that science has given us some really great information to work with?
Well, and real expertise can be very seductive, right? I mean, if you really are an expert, if you really understand something well, especially if other people keep coming to you and asking you, right, about things, it's really hard, I think, to remember what you actually are expert in, and remember to say, well, actually, you need to find someone else for that.
It's I think the kind of arcane knowledge that most lay people, like myself, I mean, there is a sense in which the intimidation about sitting on a panel with two scientists is real, because it's like
For sure.
this is a kind of knowledge that is not easily accessible to everybody at that level, and so the credibility you have in our culture to pronounce authoritatively about things comes partly from a misperception of how science works. There's not a common knowledge of how it works and what its limits are. So a person like Richard Dawkins or someone like public science intellectual can say things about ethics from the credibility of a scientist, and it's difficult to challenge because people don't recognize where the lines are drawn with that expertise.
I think part of it too is just the kind of the monolithic nature of science is like that's just how the media kind of presents it, and it's like, well, science isn't this monolithic entity. There's often disagreements. There's a whole method of peer review and all of this, and I think that in a sense we have a tendency, especially as a layman, to kind of even reduce science to this singular, almost oracular voice that's kind of pronouncing on society as a whole. And I think you're right. It's a very it's a seductive thing to kind of believe in.
Yeah.
Now, we've gotten into the next question a bit, but from your vantage point, are there different forms of scientific and genetic reduction? And here I'm thinking of Drs. Gall and Kolmes, and then we'll follow up with other questions for the whole of the panelists. But I'm distinguishing again between reductionism and reduction, whereby the former conveys negativity and the latter makes possible a positive assessment. So anything further you'd want to add at this juncture?
Well, there's certainly different ways scientists go about what you're calling reduction, right? So there's experiments where you simplify a set of variables and choose the one you're going to work on, change it, see what happens. Increasingly, in this digital world, a lot of work is done with mathematical modeling, computational methods where you change variables one by one inside a very large, complicated model, and that's a whole different undertaking. And then there are things like multifactorial analysis, where you take very complicated data sets and crunch them mathematically to try and extract the key components that are responsible for the variability. And you often end up with situations where you have compound variables with pieces of 2 or 3 different components associated with them. So it would be really reductionistic to try and describe scientific reduction as one thing.
Good
Sorry?
summary. Good summary there. And you see it in different ways. I mean, in my field in biology, you see a lot of the reduction in terms of animal models for genetic diseases or things like that. So, I mean, we obviously cannot experiment on humans, but, I might look at a particular mutation in a mouse and how does it affect a mouse. And we can actually get to the point where we can say not just how does this mutation affect a mouse, but we can get this mutation so it only shows up in the mouse's pancreas, for example, and it doesn't affect the rest of the mouse. So you see some really interesting ways that we can do the reduction there in living organisms, but then of course you also get that pulling back out into the in vitro, the test tube experiments. So,
And again, those would be, from my vantage point, positive forms of reduction. When we think of reductionism, I'm going back to Watson's point. That to me seems a bit reductionistic. And perhaps you have other things you'd want to add to set forth the distinctions, because I think sometimes people of faith, once they hear Watson's statement, they might think any form of further study in the natural science is going to be threatening to their faith. And I mean, here it is, Watson was there at the Genome Project, right, a major figure, and now we have Francis Collins, a very committed person of faith. Yeah. But still, people are threatened often because of reductionistic statements. I don't know if you'd want to add anything further to specify further reductionism from your vantage point.
Well, Watson's also known for saying that if we don't play God, who will?
Wow.
So
I think God's got a good shot at it.
I mean, talking about scientific reduction, right? There used to be a disease called smallpox. It was 30% of people who got it died. Most of the survivors were scarred for life and perhaps badly disabled in various ways. It killed more people than all the wars humans have ever fought combined, by far. And it was very simple experiments involving scientific reduction that started the pathway to the elimination of that disease. So go online, find a picture of a kid with smallpox, take a look at it, ask yourself if indeed the process of preventing that from happening to children in the future wasn't a good thing. In fact, the way we're supposed to live, right? Protecting the vulnerable. So, again, science doesn't contain a moral compass. It can be used to do terrible things, and it can be used to do wonderful things.
I think on the flip side, though, especially with the environmental side of things, smallpox is an example where we took something that is horrible to the human population and eradicated it, and yet we also see undesirable effects when we do the same thing with something else. So, for example, the gray wolf population was decimated because it was perceived as a threat to people and livestock, and yet it has caused other effects down the road. And so I think that could also be another aspect where we see a part that maybe is causing a problem, but we don't see its role in the bigger picture. And so you can make another.
Certainly, because the gray wolf was, it still is in some places, a really important keystone
Right.
component of an ecosystem, and smallpox does nothing but kill humans.
Right.
And so, in the one circumstance, the eradication of smallpox really didn't have any significant ecosystemic effects other than there being less dead humans around.
Right.
But the wolf, as we eradicated that, it caused the populations of the animals it fed upon to fluctuate wildly and lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah, I think the ethical distinction is really important, that you're saying it doesn't provide these, ways forward. But there's also, I think, a metaphysical kind of implication. In other words, one of the things that is objectionable about reductionism, the way that you're defining it, is the way that it refuses to acknowledge things about higher levels of description. So whenever something seems to cancel out in a kind of hubristic way, in a kind of arrogant way, the legitimate deliverances of other higher level studies, it seems to be a problem. Your example about the gray wolf is, I think, one example of how there is something related to this project of reductionism that is connected to a kind of control and mastery over the world. And that has roots in the development of science in the West or whatever, that technology and science are very related to each other in the way that they drive each other, and funding and grants and things like that. But there is a kind of arrogance in sort of saying, by virtue of describing, for instance, your brain states, we've completely debunked the deliverances of cognitive studies or psychology, or by virtue of mapping the human genome, we've, like this absurd statement, we've somehow uncovered something about life, the fundamental, what does the genome say about human suffering in our experience of it? What does it say about our ability to love each other? What does it say about, these ways of finding meaning and purpose in life? It's just an absurd sort of Procrustean, let's lop your legs off so you fit in the bed, and I think that's the objectionable aspect of it, and where you're describing scientists maybe going too far, not just in the ethical questions, but even determining what is, the existence of minds versus brains. Do we have souls? There's every week an article in some news outlet saying science discovers there's no God, or science discovers there's a God, as though that is within its purview. It's just clearly not. So.
Now, this is for all of the panelists. What does it look like to move beyond negative forms of scientific and genetic reduction to an expansive view of life? Here I call to mind systems biologist Dennis Noble and his engagement of Richard Dawkins on genetics, among others. And Derrick, I'm thinking of our conversations over Noble's work, The Music of Life, and even some of his more recent work. Maybe you'd like to start?
Sure. Well, with fear and trembling, considering that I'm sitting between two scientists, so I will keep this brief as to not completely expose my layman level of learning. But Dennis Noble, so he actually has another book. The first was The Music of Life, and one that was actually published this year called Dancing to the Music of Life, so he's clearly stuck on a theme. He's actually friends with Richard Dawkins, but one of the interesting things is they sort of differ, and Sarah and Steve were talking about this earlier, views of the gene and how that expresses itself and how it controls. And Richard Dawkins, in, I believe, the 1970s, wrote a book that was quite famous called The Selfish Gene, and he was really arguing for a model of the gene where the gene is really a kind of the prime causal agent for everything that the human is. So we saw that quote before where the DNA was sort of the ultimate expression of what life is, and in some sense Richard Dawkins was really elaborating on that in a vast way, not just scientifically but really at a moral level. He even at one point describes humans as lumbering robots that are carrying genetic information. And he in later editions will say, well, it's just a metaphor used to kind of help explain scientific information to a lay audience. And certainly there's a level that's true, but Dennis Noble, in his own work, stresses how much work metaphors can actually do and how much that it can actually change our perception and even the questions that we ask and we don't ask. And he, instead of saying that we're lumbering robots that just happen to be carrying genetic information, Dennis Noble really wants to stress that, and again, I'll keep this brief so not to stumble into a territory that I have no business being in, but he says that our concept of the gene has really changed over the years, and the idea of it being a solid kind of almost atomic unit in the human has really sort of opened up. The gene is always expressed, like Steve was saying, in different circumstances, and there can even be environmental feedback. And Dennis Noble is, he is currently a fellow of the Royal Society, and I believe he is professor emeritus of cardiovascular physiology at Oxford. And so he started his work on the heart and how feedback systems in the heart can impact it. So it's not just a bottom-up approach, but there's really kind of a holistic way that our being expresses itself, and he's doing that with genetics. But I think to Sharad's point too on mind, even recently, a lot of people with the emergence of AI or the talk of AI, we try to describe human consciousness in terms of computer systems. We're the hardware and our minds are the software. And I think there's a certain level at which that metaphor can help us understand, but I also think that it can really start to get things backwards. And it can really sort of limit our expectations for what we see, because, even strictly speaking, computers don't compute anything. We compute things through computers. We give them goals, we give them tasks, we give them programming and understanding. And so to say that our minds are like computers may be helpful, but I think people try to push that a little further and say, well, then we're nothing but computers. We're just
Or they double
programs.
down and say computers are cognitive machines, that they actually think.
Right.
So Daniel Dennett would just affirm that a thermostat is a kind of thinking thing.
So no, and I think that's great. And so to your question, how do we move beyond it? I think one way is to sort of be aware how our metaphors are often expressed, and I think we talked about it a little before. Is there's a legitimate and well-earned prestige that comes with being a scientist, and I think that a lot of people are often looking for authority figures to learn from, and by extension, they want to learn everything from a single person, be it Neil deGrasse Tyson or Richard Dawkins, who have very legitimate credentials in one area, but now they want to, expand it. So.
And what is Noble's preferred metaphor instead of the lumbering robots? He switches it around.
He does.
Biologist.
Yeah, he says. He uses a lot of musical metaphors, but he also wants to say that instead of genes essentially being we're just lumbering robots and the genes are inside of us. The genes are actually for Noble, they're trapped inside us. They're part of our system. They're part of who we are at expressing it. So it's he uses a lot of improvisational metaphors for music and the idea that, again, the genes can express differently at different times. There's no gene for X at any given moment. And I will cut myself off there, and I will let the scientists start weighing in.
Weigh in, everyone.
So your example, Dawkins' selfish gene, is a really the beginning of a very classic story of the extension of some science into other arenas where perhaps it ceases to have great utility. From that beginning, the whole concept of selfish genes, that led to Ed Wilson's synthesis of sociobiology. And he originally worked to explain the internal structure of social insect colonies on the basis of their genetics. Predicated, he works on ants. He's one of the world's, if not the world's foremost ant expert. Predicated on some very odd genetics of social insects that I probably should not go into. But suffice it to say, the males only have half a genome, the females have a full genome. It leads to patterns of relatedness that are very different and which help you explain their societies very, very clearly in some ways. And then that idea got extended to human societies, where we don't have that odd genetic relatedness. And in fact, I'd have to say the ideas have turned out to have remarkably little utility for explaining human behavior. But it got carried from Dawkins' idea about genes to Wilson's idea about social insects. And right up to this point, it was making very good biological sense.
Right.
And then it got passed on, well, if it works for insects, it must work for people.
Right.
And this border was crossed between the true expertise and an extension of it that all of a sudden took on all kinds of ethical dimensions. What is altruism? Is there such a thing as true altruism?
Right.
Is altruism really just hidden selfishness? And so that actually is a great example for showing that progression. And I think very few people think about humans in terms of sociobiology now. Works well for social insects.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think there's an interesting dilemma that comes up with these kinds of conversations around the nature of discovery and the nature of scientific exploration in the first place, setting up experiments, starting with a hypothesis and working your way down to whatever you've reduced your hypothesis to, and saying what can we do with this isolated instance that we're looking at, that it seems that society, at least society in the West for sure, is driven by purpose, is driven towards what's the application, what are you going to do with this, and that sometimes we have horse and cart issues, that things get a little bit out of order. And I wonder, I'd ask the two of you scientists, in what way does that sort of superimposition of a need to have a purpose behind it actually create problems for getting at what could be the good purpose of discovery in the first place? I mean, there is something to be said for exploration that you don't know what it's going to produce. Vaccines have come out of explorations that we didn't know that it was going to produce vaccines, but when it did, we ended up a grateful people, or we ended up still living people anyways. So how do you experience that dilemma? Because I see it all the time in these conversations. And
Well, I think the idea of having a purpose for our research is not just a human need, but it's also, for a scientist, it's a very practical, logistical need. If I'm going to get grant money, I have to be able to apply my research to something, and that drives the research. So whether I'm researching mutations in the fibrillin 2 protein or looking at the social biology of ants, I have to be able to say, this is how your money will be used and this is why it will be good. So, and what we will get from it that will benefit us. So it drives it, again, I think from a human perspective. You know, it's not just, oh, I want to go find out what I can, although that's certainly there, but it also drives it from a very practical standpoint.
And I would say it's a distortion of science. This need to have application to get funding, to do something that must surely be applied, limits our discoveries to our imagination. And a lot of the great discoveries that have been made because scientists were interested just in the science, not necessarily where it was going at all. And I think we've made a serious mistake saying, well, we need to invest money for social applications, and these things have to serve us in some way, because you never know what's going to serve you.
I think also in the philosophy of science, Karl Popper was the one who came up with the idea of falsification, that the idea of the hypothesis that has to be testable, falsifiable. You have this idea of quantification. If it can't be measured, it's not important, and that has a very strong strain in the sciences. I taught a course at my previous institution on research methodology, and one of the textbooks I used talked about going back to this pure question approach. What happens if I do this? And his perspective was that when we use a straight falsifiable hypothesis approach, we leave out all those other things that we could find out. When we go with a more open-ended question, we're more open to seeing other outcomes rather than I'm only looking for this outcome. And a lot of people say now there is no one scientific method, but yet if you look in any high school science textbook and a lot of college science textbooks, they still go through the, here's a hypothesis. This is what it means to have a good hypothesis. And so it's, again, I think a distortion of what it means to do science when I'm looking for a particular outcome, as opposed to we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Evelyn Fox Keller in a book, it's an older book now, but it's on gender and science. She has a section where she's challenging exactly that type of methodology. And she brings up the point that anytime we ask what accounts for X, we've already made a decision about what accounts for accounting. And that we end up isolating or leaving out a number of potential possibilities by the very way that we framed it. And so I think as we're talking about reductionism, that you end up walking that line a lot anytime you're doing that.
So I think I'll just say it's absolutely true that when you do an experiment, you have chosen a little tiny window you're looking at the world at. Nonetheless, that has produced an enormous amount of information. The only reason that starts causing trouble is people forget they're looking through a little tiny window. And so I'm not going to speak against reduction because it's had huge advances, but I think I will speak against taking this tiny window you've constructed and beginning to think that you're looking through some sort of vista.
And I think the idea of expertise comes in play too, that when somebody has built up an expertise, it gives you a little more ability to predict with more accuracy. Oh, I think things work this way, but it takes time to build up that expertise as well. I mean,
I think that the example of Dennis Noble, which I don't know anything about the guy's work. I was furiously Wikipediaing the name on the way over here, but it seems like one of the distinguishing marks of his research program is to try to do not just top or bottom up causation, research, and to see how the feedback between higher levels of description actually affect the lower levels as well. So it's not just a one-way street going up. And when you mentioned the splitting of environmental science from health sciences or whatever, without any reference to each other, it just sort of made me think, yes, tiny windows, getting an accurate, sort of very restricted, constrained view on some issue, and then refusing to apply that, too prodigally, that's fair enough. But I'm wondering whether you think maybe sometimes the fixation on breaking things down to the smallest possible units of explanation blinds people from seeing how there could maybe be downward or causation coming from above to the lower levels.
So I think you're quite right. I think going back to the example I used before, right? There's the National Institutes of Health, and there's the Environmental Protection Agency, and that split. I think for a long time that was not viewed as a problem, and then after a while they had to start to construct a patch in the middle, right? The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, right? Which is now this entity attempting to start to patch back together. I think that relates to what you're talking about. You have to structurally now try sewing back together the stuff you cut apart at the very beginning. And so you want the information to be going in both directions, and when you've separated things, it doesn't anymore. And it took 50 years, I think, to do that.
If we don't understand history, we tend to repeat it. The cases have been made that in the past, theologians reduced religion to providing the equivalent of scientific answers as if religion competed with scientific findings. This is how Richard Dawkins assesses the past in an article titled A Reply to Poole in Science and Christian Belief. God is, and I quote, a competing explanation for facts about the universe and life. This is certainly how God has been seen by most theologians of the past centuries and by most ordinary religious people today, unquote. What do you make of Dawkins's assessment? And how does this historiography or particular approach to understanding history shape us today? What do you think of Dawkins's assessment? And how does this historiography shape us today?
Well, I'm always fascinated by this question. Theology and history are my passion areas, and so I'll try not to just go off the rails here and just gung-ho, but I'm always interested how we look at discourse over the centuries and we see a continuity, but I often think that those continuities are full of differences that we tend to really gloss over. And again, I think with the rise of certain scientific explanations, there is this expectation, especially today, that it kind of pushed God out of the picture. But I think we know whose God is getting pushed out. You know, what idea of God is kind of getting left to one side. And I think the interesting piece of history here is how concepts of God really did change. And, you know, when you look at someone like a seminal figure like Thomas Aquinas, he's not invoking God to piece together certain physical explanations of the world. I mean, you have people in very early on who are naturalists, but they're also fully Christian. You know, even medievalists. There's a figure named William of Conches who has this great quote where he says, you know, God could have made a tree out of an ass or a stone, but has he ever? We have to look into this and investigate it. And he's sort of chastising some of his fellow believers who are just invoking God at every turn. And I think, I guess just the point to make initially is that there has always been a very esteemed tradition where Christians have been exhorted to turn to nature to understand it, precisely because it is God's creation, and precisely because it in its own integrity voices the glory of God. To come back to Aquinas real quick, he said that he made a distinction between primary and secondary causality. And primary causality is everything that God does, but since God is God, he's not one of a bunch of kinds of things we call gods, and he's not in the universe just as a particularly big item. His causation, if we use that word, is analogous to other types of causes, but it doesn't interfere necessarily with them, and it's not of the same type of me moving this bottle or even us talking. It's always of a higher order. And he says that if we destroy the integrity of secondary causes within the world, chains of causal sequences, you know, the ocean tides coming in, going out, the changing of the seasons, he says we actually impugn the glory of God himself, because then we're essentially implying that God couldn't have created an integrity in creation itself. And so, I guess that all of that is a very lengthy way to say that the idea that God is getting pushed out of the picture, I think we really have to start investigating what that picture of God is. Because certainly for a long time, and I would say even through a lot of the scientific revolution, many of whom were Christians, that just wasn't the picture of God. And so I think that there's really a very prestigious tradition of Christian, I suppose we could call it naturalism. That's not quite the right word. And two is really just, history is very interesting, and I think we are very biased towards certain expectations today just because we have an understanding that, well, Christianity always repressed science, or God was always pushed out of the picture, and I just don't think that's really the case.
And most noted historians today on science, or historians of science, would contend against even claims by Neil deGrasse Tyson and Dawkins along those lines.
Certainly.
Yeah, I was going to say it's just factually incorrect.
Yeah.
It's just a naive historiography that is sort of cribbed from some I think might not be too strong to say propaganda pieces from Enlightenment histories of reading their view of themselves as the apex of human civilization back through the dark corners of superstition that they emerged from as victors or something. And so it's a pretty loaded description of the historiography. But Christianity has, I think, talked about theology as a science, but not in the sense that it belongs sort of to a dogmatic observation of nature that comes from the Bible or something like that. That it was considered the queen of the sciences because it was in some ways, the highest possible level of explanation. It was the highest possible end towards which all things are moving. And as a level of description goes, it's a sort of way of saying, look, when we talk about God in the world and his work in the world, what we're saying is that this framework of God's divine action encompasses all we see through our observation of the natural world. So it's not to replace the actual study of the world in attending to all its glorious details. It's a kind of way of saying, how do we integrate that to provide both a compass and a kind of cosmic map, maybe, of saying, at the highest possible level, what are we doing here? So it's kind of the inability to distinguish between things like metaphysics and physics, which Aquinas is a perfect example of doing that so meticulously well. It's hard to see how one could make this sort of a statement without,
So in other words, what I hear you saying is that the God that Dawkins and company reject, Aquinas probably would have rejected
absolutely,
as well.
absolutely, and Augustine too, and Gregory of Nyssa, and people far before the Middle Ages. So
Others?
I think it's to go off what Sharad was just saying, it's a question of and what Derrick was saying, it's a question of confusing the primary cause and the secondary cause, and looking at, we get so focused sometimes on the secondary cause that we forget that there is a primary cause above that. And that if we look at all of nature as part of God's creation and his revelation to us, that he speaks through our studies of his nature or his creation. But we should not replace his secondary causes, or we should not replace his primary causes with his secondary. And we need to keep that distinction, that we study the creation as a way to study the creator.
I think Dawkins is, he's known as a provocateur, so in the times when you see him raising statements like this that pit one faction against another, the factions may not have, in fact, existed prior to the statement, that the statement actually creates a mythical reality, a mythical competition. I think one of the interesting things about where this conversation has been so far this evening is the idea of use of metaphor and analogy, and the fact that for a very long time, theologians, going back to the earliest centuries of the church, have acknowledged that the way that we think and speak about God is by way of analogy. And that scientifically, we're limited by the exact same language that we have to use theologically. And we even have to create new words, but those words are still not wholly representative. And in fact, the process of speaking them changes it. So there's all these levels of overlap in the themes that we're talking about with reductionism, and even the descriptive words that we might use to use it. I think there's common ground in both of those worlds that we tend to neglect, that says we're doing the best we can with what we have, but we're limited to metaphors and analogies. And there are places where those are non-competing, where really what they're doing is they're layering, and if you've piled up too high, then you have to carve some back away again. But I think science and religion has a lot of common ground to build on, just by the very nature of the fact that both have the exact same linguistic limitation.
And both have a shared search for truth, and they both have a shared belief that there's more to the world than meets the eye.
That's right. Yeah, that's really good.
How they don't necessarily have the same perspective on how there's more to the world than meets the eye, but they both have that belief that there's more than what we see.
That's good.
Well, when I was listening to Sharad, I was thinking how very close you were to quoting from Teilhard de Chardin.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Who was a scientist and a priest who felt, as I think a lot of scientists feel, that people of faith have nothing to fear from science. In fact, it's all trying to understand everything around us, and inconsistencies are in the central tenets of faith and in science are certainly not going to emerge, because there is only one world around us. I think that at the danger of being reductionistic here, I think that part of this division comes not from science or theology, but from human nature.
Yeah.
There's, at least in my career, I've seen there's really two sorts of academics, and there's one sort I call the minors, and these are people who choose a topic and they dig incredibly deep. They study and study and study and go deeper and deeper on their expertise and in both science and in theology.
Oh yeah.
And often end up knowing more and thinking more deeply on that specific topic than anyone else in the world. But when they're down into the depth of this understanding, they can't see each other.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
They just can't because they know an enormous amount, but only about
One tiny topic.
what they have mined their way to, which, don't get me wrong, is not something that
Sure.
you can't help but value it.
Sure.
It gets us places. There are other academics who I tell the students as they're looking for their careers, they have to understand their personality. Some are explorers, right? Who go to the edges of disciplines and look at the interactions and try to understand how this body of knowledge and that body of knowledge and this body of knowledge fit together. So I think these conflicting worldviews come in part from both science and theology, from these minors who've really got great expertise but are unable to really see the other's perspective. And what we need, both among theologians and scientists, is more explorers. Scientists who are interested in discussing the edges of theology and science in terms of public policy and the environment, and theologians who are interested in doing exactly the same thing. So I think it's not the discipline so much, but the personalities of scholars that have led to a lot of this.
It reminds me, and I think there's some analogy here, of a conversation that supposedly took place between Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell, where Whitehead said to Russell, "Bertrand, there are two kinds of people in the world, the simple-minded and the muddle-headed. Bertrand, you're the simple-minded, I'm the muddle-headed." I think one was really focusing on, the atomistic structures and did a lot of good work in that regard. And that would have been more Russell, in my estimation, and Whitehead was more the explorer, the metaphysical structures and but still muddle-headed, and they both have their emphasis, but they both need the other, so to speak. And I hear you talking, at least from my vantage point, in similar terms. Minors and explorers get at that a bit. How does this entire discussion bear on society, including spirituality and church life today? Let's start off with our pastors, David and Sharad.
I think one of the ways it bears on church life is, in particular, a sense of hope that Christians have, and the fact that if God is involved in the world, then God can be involved in science. And that instead of setting science or holding science at arm's length, we can engage science with a deep wonder. I think there's worship in the engagement with science that can happen if it's facilitated. A lot of times it's not facilitated, though. Instead, we've built barriers and barriers in front of barriers to finding that commonality. And we lose some of the excitement that I think is potential within our communities. And that excitement could actually be mutual. It could be put out towards science as an encouraging word towards brothers and sisters that are working in that field. And there's reciprocity with that. I know our time's short, so I'll leave it with that.
Sharad?
Well, I just think that the implications are massive, because there is a kind of pressure on people to see matters of faith as somehow either bracketed so far away from these issues that they hide from a legitimate source of revelation in the world, which is God's creation, that they're, I think, by virtue of their faith, required to attend to, But the other sort of, there's obviously missing out on all the opportunity for wonder and worship that comes from attending to the creation. But there's also a kind of danger in bracketing God away, so that instead of seeing the classically Christian conception of God as being the ground of all being, the one who sustains the entire existence of the creation in being at every moment, not just one who's set the touch paper and set the dominoes going, to mix metaphors, but there's a kind of almost competition between ways in which a person's spirituality can be pit against things like medical care, psychological care for mental illness. You cut yourself off from all of these common grace resources that God would give the church by virtue of saying, well, I trust in God, not in, science. So yeah, I think the implications are pretty enormous, and of course for the souls of scientists themselves who need to be part of our faith communities, to see themselves not as feared or exiled, but as by doing good work, doing the work of God in the world. So.
Derrick, your thoughts as someone working in the history of science and the like, and how that bears on present discussions with faith in relationship to science?
Yeah. Well, I affirm everything they just said, and really, I think where they're touching on like how all the spheres of life today can really be combined back into a more holistic and I think healthy kind of whole, where the church doesn't need to be scared of the scientists that are often part of their own congregations. But I think also from a historical perspective, there's, I think, the expectation, especially at kind of a pop cultural level, that the church did really terrible things to scientists in the past. And I think because of that, there's a certain fear that we now cut ourselves off from that legacy and that richness. And there's a fear to not kind of embrace a lot of that history that's a lot more complicated and a lot more, I would say, nuanced than a lot of people give it credit for.
Sure.
And I speak personally too. Today I didn't think there was a lot of conflict between science and religion. I mean, maybe in a couple areas, but I was like, there's Galileo or what have you. And I remember the first real opening onto that is the idea of a flat Earth. Christians believed in a flat Earth, and that's kind of the quintessential example of their backwardness. But looking into it, no one actually believed in a flat Earth,
right.
And that itself was kind of a late myth.
Right.
I do though.
Yeah. Besides,
what do you say?
We're cutting you out of this. Anyway, so all that is to say that Christianity, on a theological and on a, I guess what anachronistically we can call a natural scientific level, has an enormously enriching history, and I think that overcoming this fear can encompass fears not just today, but looking back and kind of resourcing our own heritage.
Yeah,
wonderful.
That's great.
Brief comments from Sarah and Steve?
I think one thing on the side of the scientists, I think one thing that scientists need to do is we need to be able to communicate better with the lay audience, because I think sometimes as researchers we get so into our fields and we get so used to that jargon that we forget to bring back to a broader audience what we're doing. And so that's something I've really been struck with this year, is that we need, as scientists, we need to do a better job of communicating our own work. And I think another thing that especially Christians, scientists who are Christians, need to do is to be more open to talk about our faith. And I know that's one thing that I have felt in churches at various points is, I don't have the right view, or whatever's the expected view. And I think the church needs to understand that while there are different views on all sorts of theological issues, there's also different views on science and how that fits in. So I think a measure of graciousness on both parts. One, to realize I'm not always as clear as I should be, or not communicating as well, but there's a lot of different perspectives out there.
Steve?
It seems to me that the church, to continue its historic mission with relevance to people's lives, has to embrace the world of science that's emerging. And scientists, in order to be able to work towards the common good, need to go to the only place that people spend time talking about what's right and wrong and ethics and morality in this society to any great extent, which is the churches. And we have so many challenges to find how we need to move forward towards a common good for all of us, that I think both groups have to reach out to the other.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, panelists. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the desire to engage such difficult subjects such as scientific and genetic reductionism and moving forward toward an expansive view of life. And it's so in keeping with what we're seeking to do with this focus on church and science, partners for the common good. So again, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.